in your work for writing for newspapers and for journals and so on, I know that you have identified what you call sort of current biases and prejudices in the art world. Would you like to identify some of those for us? What you see is going on just now?
Well, no, this is when we were talking the other day, and we were talking about the way that, I mean, I guess there's a degree of, what you call gatekeeping going on, and anybody that's working as a writer or as a gallerist or running a contemporary art course or whatever. But um, and I was explaining that I can't just write about what I want to write about. Everything that I do, I have to pitch. So even though I have a regular beat for the eye, I have to pitch every month all of the different things I'm interested in, and I have to advocate for them. The same with the Guardian, and even with Apollo. Although I have a degree of um, freedom in what I write about with Apollo, I still need to pass it by my editor beforehand. Um, and of course, I've, in the past, I guess, 10 years, I've advocated quite strongly to make sure that we're not replicating historic biases in our coverage, because newspaper editors who aren't necessarily experts in the art world, they're always going to be attracted to the most known names. And if you just let the newspaper editors constantly go for what felt familiar to them, you just end up, covering Damien Hirst and Jeff Koons.
Is
And
that what you mean by historic bias? Is
well, I mean, yes, so it's I mean, it's going to, I mean, historic bias anyway, we know has been towards white men, but they tend, it's quite difficult to get people excited in, particularly once papers become more angled towards looking at the metrics of what people are looking at online. They tend to want to play it safe because their priority is to get clicks on the page and for those clicks to translate into subscriptions. And their metrics tell them they don't get enough subscriptions coming through if the show's outside London, which I think, I mean, to me, this is really, I think it says a lot about the way that newspapers now view themselves and their role in the kind of national culture, because I'd always assumed that newspapers saw themselves as contributing towards the national culture in a certain way, that they were, providing a kind of balance of opinion and a balance of coverage, and they were providing, news coverage to their readership wherever they might be. And from the perspective of regional galleries and museums, it's tremendously important to have coverage, not because my coverage is so particularly wonderful, but for example, if you're dependent on Arts Council funding to show that you're getting national newspaper coverage, it would be really, really important for the continuation of your funding. And also in a time when everything seems to be slanting a lot more right wing, and a lot of the coverage in the more right wing arts press tends to be extremely knee jerk. I think it's very important to have that balanced out by having, two kind of liberal newspapers covering the arts in a reasonably serious way. Uh,
but so their strategy is based entirely on self-preservation, basically.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and which is so disheartening, really. And then, how would you characterize the sort of coverage in what you call the sort of the right-wing press?
I mean, I think that there's, I mean, I think they like a certain degree of kind of sensationalistic coverage, and they seem to certainly have, there seems to be a kind of quite knee-jerk response to things like feminist art exhibitions or anything that's to do with collectives or kind of I guess what they think of as like the woke agenda. And I think there's certainly a pressure on some of the critics to pander to that kind of tendency within the paper as well.
What they think their readers,
Yeah.
yeah, right?
Where is the free discourse then? The free critical discourse? Where can we go for that? Does it exist right now?
I think it's really difficult. I mean, when I've lectured on this in the past, I've taken students through all kinds of different kinds of publication and asked them where they found free critical discourse. And when you think about glossy arts magazines, they're very dependent on the advertising from galleries. Glossy arts magazines that are associated with international art fairs are very dependent not only on the advertising from galleries, but also on those galleries paying to be in their art fairs. Um, glossy magazines that are dependent on advertising from luxury goods companies are perhaps sometimes even more conservative. So in the past, I would have said that actually newspapers were one of the few places where you could have a fairly, good open bit of, you were very free in what you could say in general. But I think that those spaces for free critical discourse are really, really shrinking. And in general, there's this idea that people aren't particularly interested in reading reviews. They want opinion pieces. They want hot takes. And those seem to be the kinds of, the features that get more attention.
Well, Hettie, this, it's really eye-opening, getting it as well coming from you, coming from an insider. And I'm sure people have questions related to what Hettie's just been discussing. So if you do, please put your name in the chat, and then we'll come back to this in the Q&A. But Hettie, I'd like to move you on to what we call the interim years. So before we come up to some of your present projects, which are terribly exciting. I know that from your initial career in London, you then went abroad for a number of years. Do you want to just tell us a little bit about that? About your I'm not going to say wilderness, because they're very exciting places, but we can.
Okay, so in 2000, I had a son, and in December of that year, I moved to the States for a year. So the father of my children had a job that took him around the world to an extent. So I moved for a year to Washington, DC, which also happened to be the year of 9/11. So it was a peculiar time to be there. I mean, in retrospect, probably an interesting time, but it was quite alarming to be there on the ground. And from there, we moved for 4 years to Istanbul, where I had another son, and was quite involved in the art scene over there. So I did continue to write and to be involved in, and to be involved in the art world and kind of the artistic discourse. And then I lived in Belgium for 5 years, where I was working as a section editor for a magazine, and eventually the editor-in-chief of quite it was long enough ago that I can say it was a kind of quite a kind of fashionable magazine, like a fashionable photography and culture magazine. And I curated a couple of exhibitions over there. And then in 2010, I moved back to London as a single parent, and it was right when the credit crunch was happening, and the financial, it was a bad moment financially to be moving back to London without any contacts. And this was in a kind of slightly less internationalist period. And so my experience overseas didn't seem to count for very much, which was quite odd. And it was also a period where I was trying to get curatorial roles in museums, and all of the museums were laying off 25% of their staff. And my name no longer had any currency on newspapers, and after 10 years away, nobody remembered who I was. And so I started working for a while at Phaidon Press as a project editor for their arts titles, and then on the editorial team at Art Review magazine. So it was only about, I think, 8 years ago that I went freelance and was really writing full time again. And so I think most of what you see of my career has happened, weirdly enough, in those last 8 years. Although, of course, there was many, many years of experience and learning that went behind that's informed it all.
In glamorous foreign destinations.
Glamorous foreign destinations, yes. But I think
sorry. No, I was just wondering how, just to move back a step there, how did you find it when you returned back to the UK as a single parent? What were the challenges?
It was rubbish. I mean, it's really interesting coming from Brussels, where in Belgium it's just assumed that women will work and that that you will have kids, and so it's really normal for people to do stuff with their kids at the weekends, whether that's going to the museum or going to fancy fashion shops or whatever. They've got brilliant public transport. They've got amazing playgrounds everywhere. Everywhere's very accommodating of children. All of the schools have what's called a garderie service. So if you're late to pick your kid up, you just kind of like pay a small amount for every 15 minutes they're there. So if you regularly work until 5:30, your kid can stay at school until 5:30, and then you just collect them. There's not that whole, I mean, you know, that stress of like having to be at the school gate at 3:20, and if you're not there at exactly 3:20, you're being given the evils by people, and it's just so stressful, particularly if you're living somewhere like London where it's, you know, it takes you an hour to get anywhere, and the public transport's very hit and miss, so you can end up getting caught out somewhere and your child gets stranded, and it's terribly stressful. You know, and they've got subsidized children's activities during the holidays, so you're not having to pay for enormously expensive holiday courses. So it's just the whole way that the society is set up for working parents and to accommodate that. And you come to the UK and it's just like it's a freakish afterthought, and yet most mothers work. So it was really difficult, and I think for a long time, basically, there was no space to do anything apart from work to the degree that I could, and, you know, be there for my kids. But I think one thing that it really informed later on, because we're going to come to all of the How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers stuff. One thing that in retrospect became really evident is that because all you have time for under those circumstances are to be at the office and then dash home, you don't realize it's happening to anybody else. Because I wasn't going to the lovely art world dinners, I wasn't going to the private views, I wasn't off on press trips, I wasn't going to the Venice Biennale, I wasn't doing all of those kind of glamorous accoutrements that come with art world stuff. My colleagues were all doing that. My colleagues were flying off to Brazil and going out to dinners and meeting lots of people and burnishing themselves. I was slowly kind of slipping further and further into the background. But I think when you don't realize that other people are going through the same thing as you don't realize that you're part of a general kind of like a systemic problem. And as I say, we're going to move on to How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers in a minute. But I think it took me until I was out the other side of it to realize that actually I'd fallen foul of something that was a bit wrong with the art world at that point.